Hidden fifths and octaves. Every note contains overtones, the octave and the fifth being the first two overtones of the fundamental tone that you're starting with. Therefore, if you use the fifth or the octave above a root note, it'll blend with the root note, making it have an inconspicuous nature. In the motion of consecutive fifths or octaves, the interval does not distinguish itself from the root because it is harmonizing with that overtone. This is not what we want in counterpoint. This is why consecutive fifths and octaves are never allowed in good counterpoint. On the other hand, contrary motion distinguishes one note from another. But then there's the question, can you have a compound octave traveling in contrary motion to another octave or vice versa? Or the same thing thinking about fifths. No, this would not be allowed and would be considered parallel octaves or fifths by contrary motion, even though this sounds ridiculous and contradictory to itself in the word itself. This is a rule and it is a real word, so this would apply to octaves and fifths. Again, going in contrary motion to consecutive, so two fifths that one is compound, one isn't, or octaves where one is compound, one isn't. So it is in contrary motion, but it's consecutive intervals. However, when going from an octave in contrary motion to a fifth or vice versa, it is fine. These are not consecutive intervals because you're going from a perfect octave to a perfect fifth or vice versa, and because you have the contrary motion there, and you're going to a different interval, this is allowed. This is probably one of the best things you can do if you're going from an octave to a fifth or vice versa. But because you're using two perfect intervals still, it's maybe not something that you're going to actually strive to do, but it's something that you are able to do. And furthermore, if one of the notes from a fifth or octave is staying oblique and the other one is leaping, this can be acceptable, but it's not ideal and should be avoided. And also, if you get a little bit stricter than that, the soprano with any other voice where the soprano is leaping into an octave or a fifth would not be allowed at all. And then if you get even more strict than that, you don't want to have hidden fifths or octaves at all. Okay, so what are hidden fifths and hidden octaves? Hidden fifths and hidden octaves in a scenario here where we're just looking at note to note or chord to chord. It can be multiple things, including a fifth, let's say, from your bass to your soprano, from your bass to alto, or can even be fifths that are hidden in the middle. Like here we have a fifth going from the tenor line D to A in the soprano line, because as you can see, compared to the other intervals, like for example above it where you have on the treble staff here, and you can see that the two intervals, you could easily see where they are on the lines away from each other. But here this interval is a little bit more hidden. And also with passing tones, you can be creating hidden octaves or fifths. But here's just a one-to-one example. So the rules of voice leading discourage the approach to a fifth or octave by anything other than oblique or contrary motion. If you want to listen to the examples, just skip to the end and I'll have a timestamp. And they'll have these examples played one after another so you can also see them back to back and compare them. So here in the first example, we have a hidden fifth. So when you listen to the example, there's an ambiguity in terms of where the voices of the first chord are going. Where does this G note resolve to? Does it resolve up to this A, or does it resolve to this D? And just to further analyze this, so let's look what's going on here. We have from the tenor to alto, we have a G and a C, so that's a fourth right there, and then that's going to a fifth of D and A. And when you look what's going on, the C is going down to A, down a third, and then the G is going down to D, down a fourth. So you see it's the direct motion, the similar motion to the perfect interval. Furthermore, G, if you actually thought about where this would be, this note right here, and then that would be right under the note A, so it almost is like this G wants to resolve up to this being a note one step down from it, but in fact it's actually wanting to also resolve down to here, also being the tenor voice. But then with that, when you hear it, it's confusing. You don't actually hear the proper voice leading where you can follow the voice very well, and it doesn't sound very good either. And when you're thinking about voice leading, if you're just thinking about the notes in the chords harmonizing together, that's a whole different perspective, and it might sound good like that. So when you're listening back to these, You're not listening for, okay, does this sound good or does this sound bad, just that. You're thinking, does this sound good when I'm thinking about all four of these voices and I'm trying to follow all four of these voices as they move on to the next chord? Do each four of those voices sound good? And that's the perspective that we're thinking when we're analyzing the voice leading here. So that's where a lot of people in voice leading, you'll see the comments in the YouTube videos, people say, the chords sound perfectly good to me, or people say, I keep replaying the video over and over, and it sounds perfectly fine to me, I don't see why. And also sometimes in the video, the person the whole time will be saying, that doesn't sound good, this doesn't sound good. And it's because they're thinking about each of the voices. They're trying to follow each of the voices, so it doesn't sound good in that context. And sometimes when people don't realize that's the perspective, that's the medium that they're looking through, then people might just watch the video and try to think about, okay, the chords harmonizing together, and not think of each of the individual voices. Okay, this moves us on to the next example. When voices move in contrary motion, it helps to distinguish where the voices are going. As time progressed, many exceptions to the hidden fifth and octave rule have been introduced. Many agree that in some instances where a fifth or octave interval is approached by similar motion, the individuality of the voices was not lost if one of the voices moves stepwise. This makes perfect sense because it is more difficult to lose track of a voice if it moves stepwise. Okay, so we can see a hidden fifth here in the tenor to the alto. We have a D to an A, and then we're starting from a third, and you can see where it's going up a fourth in the alto, but in the tenor it's moving up a step. So some would consider this acceptable because one of the voices is moving up a step. And again, this is probably not something that you'd strive to do, but you might find this acceptable when you listen to this. You should make your own conclusion, and you should also realize that this might sound good or bad in one scenario, and it might sound different in another scenario. Some other things to point out is that we have an octave here in the bass and the tenor, a C and a C. It's moving in contrary motion to what would actually be a compound fourth of A and D. Okay, next we see a compound fifth or a hidden fifth between the bass and the soprano. So we have a C here and a G up here creating a compound fifth. And then as you can see, it's moving in similar motion away from this compound fifth to what would be a compound sixth in between the bass and the soprano here with A and F. And you can see the soprano is moving down a step. So as it's leaving from this octave, it's also not leaping away from it, it's moving down a step, just something to note. Okay, so in this next example, we see a hidden fifth between the bass and the soprano moving in similar motion. So bass to soprano, C to E is going to D and A. You can also see the soprano is leaping up into the fifth. Less strict music theorists state that hidden fifths and octaves are all fine except for the instance where they occur between the bass and the soprano, especially if the soprano is leaping. Some in that similar category might also say, okay, the soprano shouldn't leap at all. The soprano should always move up by a step. The bass and the soprano, being the two outer layers, normally stand out the most in the music compared to the middle layers, which have an ability to blend more. Also, the bass note is rich with overtones, which includes the overtone of a fifth, which is going to appear in that bass clef. So if we think about the overtone series, and first we're going to start in this note C, we'll think about the first overtone would be a C above it, which would be middle C. And then if we think what would be above that, the next overtone, a fifth above this, so we'd have an octave and a fifth would be our next overtone. So from the C, we'd go up to G. So that would be our second line on the treble clef. Okay, so imagine a very strong sense of an overtone here in the treble clef on the note G, and especially a stronger one on C because your first overtone is your strongest, your second is weaker, and it goes weaker from there. But also the fact that your bass notes have very strong overtones compared to something that would be higher. Okay, so now we have the perspective that there's an overtone here. And then from there, you're moving to where I was saying you have the other fifth of D and A. So with that, the same thing, above the D, you'd have D right below this F you're looking at. And then if you're thinking about your next overtone above that D, you'd have an A above the F you're looking at. So that would be an octave lower than the A above it right here. So then you'd also have a fifth in the overtone with the lower note harmonizing with the A that is getting approached in direct motion. So there's a lot of things going on here. Also, many will say that hidden octaves and fifths only are forbidden when they occur between the soprano voice with any other voice and the soprano leaps into the fifth or octave. So in this case, the hidden fifth or octave begins to stick out too much. In my case, I would consider this to be accurate unless the soprano makes the hidden fifth or octave with the bass voice. That is something I would completely avoid. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you liked it, show me a thumbs up so I could see that you liked it. Give me a comment, tell me what you think about it. Give me a question if you had any questions. And subscribe to see more videos. I'm going to have a whole lot more coming out. Okay, until next time, take care.